The Jobs and Skills Summit is still underway at the moment, a discussion going on at the moment that will centre on industrial relations, in particular the so-called BOOT, the Better Off Overall test, and multi-employer bargaining. So we'll hear from Tony Burke soon on that, and that will be interesting to see where the government's headed on that. We did have a key speech earlier today from Danielle Wood from the Grattan Institute. She is the CEO. She spoke about Australia's economy essentially not performing well over the past couple of decades. She's blamed a lack of competition and also says that we need to get things moving on childcare and paid parental leave. I spoke to her a short time ago. Danielle Wood, thanks for your time. You've described the economy as older, fatter and slower. Not a ringing endorsement. What do you mean exactly?
What I mean is if we look over the past 10 years in particular, what we've seen is fewer new firms coming into markets, so less entrepreneurialism. We've seen fewer firms exiting markets, so more of the kind of zombie firms sticking around, and much slower rates of job switching, so people are not moving around, which is really important for actually getting the movement of resources from lower productivity firms to higher productivity firms.
So what do we know about why this is happening? Because supposedly it's this sort of era where anyone can create a company. Online is so much easier, but it's not happening for some reason.
Yeah, it's $1 million question. So one school of thought is that just the competitive pressures in the economy are less, so firms are able just to kind of sit fat and happier than they have been. So there's a question about whether we should be looking at our competition laws. There's broader questions though about whether we're delivering people with the right skills and training that the market needs. So Job Summit very much talking about things like the vocational education and training system, which is really important, I think, for getting that dynamism. And then there's broader conversations, of course, about things like IR and tax, which also play a role as well.
So much conversation about IR happening not far from us right now. Competition laws, can you single out a couple that are really emblematic of what you're talking about here, of why they allow the status quo to stay perhaps too easily?
Well, look, if I look at the comments of the former ACCC Commissioner, he was there for 10 years, and he's pointed to the mergers laws in particular. So he sort of said there's difficulty the ACCC intervening and stopping companies accruing market power.
As in, mergers are too easy to happen, or you can't stop them, it's too hard to say, no, that will reduce competition.
Yeah. So
and you create these giant companies.
Exactly. So where a merger might substantially lessen competition, his view is that it's harder for the ACCC to intervene now than it once was.
Okay. Maintaining full employment, you've spoken about the importance of that. I guess the big question is, what is full employment? Because we've had this accidental experiment, migration basically stops, unemployment's gone way down to 3.4%, but that's not seen as sustainable given we don't have enough workers right now. So can you put a number? What's full employment?
Look, I'm going to leave that to the Reserve Bank and Treasury wonks, but the point of full employment as an economic concept is basically the point at which you've got wages growing sustainably. So labour market's not so tight. And probably at the moment, I think arguably we are over full, as you say. Unemployment's a bit lower than is sustainable.
There are more jobs than people right now, and it's always hard to match one-to-one anyway. So that's a clear problem you'd agree with just at the moment.
Exactly right. So it's going to be somewhere higher. The full employment rate will be somewhat higher than where we are now. But, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we actually do want unemployment to stay low, because it means that people are now getting into jobs that couldn't do so in the past.
All right, well, that's one for people to wrestle with, I suppose, and migration, interest rates and all the sort of things that feed into it. But what you called there as well was sustainable wage rises. So this comes back to this debate around, are workers getting fair compensation? It seems difficult to sort of put a finger on. I've seen so many different graphs everywhere on, look at productivity versus wage rises and look how much companies are taking in profits. Is it easy to be definitive about, how the mix is going right now between profit and capital for companies and wages?
I mean, what is clear is that the profit share has been rising at the expense of the labour share. I think the most compelling work I've seen done certainly suggests that of the productivity gains in the past 15 years, a lower share is now going to workers than was in the past. So it suggests there has been a bit of a structural shift in the economy.
What sort of number are we talking about? What's the difference, the old and the new, the percent of that productivity workers are getting?
So certainly in terms of the kind of broader labour share, that's down about 5%, I think, over that period. What causes that is really difficult to answer definitively. Some people will point to decline in bargaining and union power. It might be about this decline in dynamism and people not switching jobs so much.
The boldness to just go, I'm going to switch jobs, because there's been a lot of uncertainty over the last 10 years, sort of post-GFC, and that ability to go, I'm going to look for a new job, I'm worth it, or I've got confidence I'll get one?
Yeah, that's hard. It's hard to be bold, and we know particularly for vulnerable workers, that's a risk. Shifting jobs is a risk. You lose some degree of that security. That's why in my speech I actually also pointed to unemployment benefits as being an important part of this. We need to know if
they're higher, you're not as worried about being unemployed for 3 or 4 months.
Exactly right. You know that there's a safety net there that's going to catch you. Yes, of course, you're still going to take an income hit, but at the moment it's basically kind of forcing you into deep poverty.
Yeah.
That's a hard risk for people to take.
You've spoken about more funding for childcare. It just seems to have become this bottomless pit. We put more money in, the prices inch up. Is there a fundamental issue, and I don't know whether we've missed the boat on this or not, but if childcare were attached and funded and done the same way as primary schools, government ones, you could either go government childcare, which is close to being free, go private if you want a different experience for your child. Would that be an ideal world?
I think it probably would be an ideal world, and we know that learning doesn't begin at 5. So I think if we had recognised that earlier on, probably integrating it better with the primary school system, making it free and accessible, would have been a very nice place to be. It's not the world we're in. We've got the system that we have.
So we can't get back to, if there was a moment to do that 10 or 20 years ago, it's past, do you think?
There's people looking at this at the margin, so trying to integrate in early learning and care into primary schools, for example. That is happening in places, but to sort of wholesale reform the system from here would be pretty challenging. You're right, we do put a lot in terms of subsidies, but this pays off in terms of actually getting people to work, and we still provide much less government support for our system than most other countries.
I guess the question is not should we give the money, but is it actually how much of it is being soaked up by centres, which has become a bit of an issue.
And the government's asking the ACCC to look at that as they increase the subsidy to make sure that this isn't kind of being pulled out in the value chain.
Hard to pin down though, I think. And final one, paid parental leave, an increase on this. I think this is interesting. We've got a gender pay gap. Paid parental leave is minimum wage, the government scheme. So you can increase how long it is, but if you don't increase how much, if it's usually the woman earning less money, she'll be the one taking all of the paid parental leave and a bigger gap in her career and falling further behind. Is that a fundamental issue as well?
Look, it is a challenge, but I don't think it's the number one issue with paid parental leave. It's worth noting in a third of cases, women earn more than men prior to the birth of the child, and they still are the ones that take the leave.
There's a reason to at least take some of the leave. The woman's giving birth, obviously.
Indeed.
All I'm talking about, I guess, is the choice when you're talking about if a year's being taken off, if half gets taken by the father instead of the mother.
Yeah, and I think that's what's really important. When we look around the world, we do have one of the least generous paid parental leave schemes in the world. Those countries where they have set aside some leave for fathers and said, this is for you, that is actually when you start to see this shift with dads being more engaged in those early years. That persists when the child is younger, and then that provides greater opportunities for women to participate in the paid workforce. So I think that's where the real action is in terms of paid parental leave.
The one tricky thing about that is if you've got a family where the father's earning more money and they're forced to take part of the leave, they're actually worse off financially than if the mother did. So is it about maybe choice, or can you give a percentage of someone's salary, something like that, so it's not as much of a financial punishment in that circumstance?
So I think most of the schemes set up will still provide flexibility and allow for whoever wants to be the primary carer to take the majority, but it is about taking a component. Yes, in an ideal world, would it be a higher share of salary and not paid at minimum wage? Absolutely. Okay. But we have budget constraints, and so we've got to work out which margins are going to give the biggest effect.
We'll let you get back to the summit. Danielle Wood, thanks for your time today.
Thanks for having me, Tom.